Good afternoon. My name is Ken Randall, and I'm the Ken in the Live with Kellye Ken. And to my right is my co-host, my better half, Kellye Testy, who's a former law school dean and the president and CEO of LSAC. I'm also a former law school dean and the president of iLaw Distance Education, which is part of the BARBRI Innovations Group. I want to tell Kellye happy anniversary. This is officially our one-year anniversary of doing Kellye Ken Live. We did it at SEALS last summer. We were the only speakers. At that time, we were following what the ABA House of Delegates was doing on some of the ABA proposed rule changes for the section of legal education. And we had so much fun, and I think we had a good reaction that we said, let's try it every month. So every month we come together, and typically it's a remote webinar where we have 5 or 6 of us all online with people logging in and then also watching us in archived. Today we're going to try something even a little more complex, and that's that we have live panelists, we have remote panelists, we have live audience and remote audience. And if it all goes well, it's due to iLaw, great technology, and if it goes badly, it's the hotel, damn technology. I want to thank everyone for tuning in or being here. I'm going to introduce our panel. We are appreciative of them making time for us. To the best of my ability, I'm going to go from right to left, and then I'll ask Kellye to take over. This is an area where she has some great expertise. So to my right, dialing in remotely, Dr. Mark Raymond, who is an assessment consultant of much renown, has worked with major institutions on major projects. And then also dialing in remotely is our second PhD, also an expert in assessments, and that's Dr. Kellie Millwood Hill, who's a director of efficacy and research at the Khan Academy. And then present in the room, again to my right, we have 3 deans. Delighted to have you with us. We have Dean Luke Bierman of Elon University. We have Dean Melanie Wilson of Tennessee. We have Christiana, Ochoa of Indiana Bloomington, the Maurer School of Law. And again, deans and experts, thanks for being with us. And Kellye, I'll let you start us with the topic.
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. And I also wish Ken a happy anniversary. It's very fun to be back at SEALS for the 1-year marker of having done this program together. And I really appreciate all of you being here in the late afternoon, and want to also say a special thanks to Mark and Kellye who are with us remotely, and our 3 deans who joined us today. We chose the topic of assessment for this panel today. It's something that, of course, as legal educators, we need to be thinking about in a variety of contexts. And I want to confess to you that it wasn't until I joined the Law School Admission Council as the president that I really realized how extensive the field of educational assessment and how much legal education is sometimes not as connected with that as we might be. So as we begin our discussion, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask our panelists some questions and follow those up. And then I also want to make sure you know that both for those of you here and those of you online, there will be opportunity for you to ask questions as we get through a portion of the initial rounds. And I want to make sure you know that if I'm looking at my phone, I'm not texting someone else. That's how we're getting questions from people who are not here in the audience, and those are feeding in. So let me begin, Mark, with Mark Raymond. And Mark, thanks again for joining us. You know, are someone I've met since I've come to LSAC, as I've met so many people who actually went to school to study to be psychometricians or to work in the field of educational assessment. And you have here a group of legal academics who are very interested in this field. So I want to ask you one of those kind of starter questions that I know is too broad, but maybe you can help narrow it a little bit. And that is just, what are some of the core principles from your position as an expert in assessment that all of us should keep in mind when we're thinking about how to do assessments well? Can you give us a little bit of a primer, so to speak?
I'd be happy to respond to that question. First, let me say that I'm delighted to be here with you, Kellye. Thank you, and Ken. And to the rest of the panelists. I'm looking forward today to learning more about legal education and the legal education process and how assessment is involved there. In terms of core principles, I think most testing experts would agree that there are two core principles: reliability and validity. And to that, I'd like to add a third one, utility. So I'll start with reliability a little bit. And it basically refers to the utility, the reproducibility of a test score. So for example, if someone takes an essay exam consisting of 3 essay questions on one occasion, they get 82%, how similar would their score be on repeated attempts of test on the same content, scored by perhaps different graders or different essays? So reliability refers to the consistency of their scores on either real or theoretical repeated measurements. The second and more important core principle, I think, is validity. And it refers to the extent to which test scores measure what they claim to measure. And the evidence used to support validity really depends on the purpose of the test and the decisions that are being made on the basis of the test scores on that test. For example, validity evidence for the LSAT would be different from the evidence required to support the multi-state bar exam. And the evidence for those exams would be different from the type of evidence that a dean might want to see for the formative assessments used in their law school. So the third principle I'd like to talk about a little bit is that test scores need to have utility. They need to be useful. And I think specifically when we're talking about educational assessment and formative assessment, the test scores need to produce actionable feedback to its users. And I think this is especially important for classroom assessments or tests to measure student progress. But useful feedback can also be important for high-stakes standardized tests such as the LSAT or the MBE.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you getting those key concepts out for us. And Kelly, I want to turn to you now. Thank you again for joining us from the Khan Academy. I think most people in the room know that our organizations have entered into an innovative partnership so that we can provide free LSAT preparation for all law school candidates, and we've sure enjoyed working with all of you in that. Part of what we love is the overlap in our missions, and we love that the Khan Academy says they believe that anyone can learn anything. And Kelly, I wonder if you could share a little bit about how you all think about the role of assessment in the great work that you do in so many subject areas.
Sure, thanks, and great to be here, everyone. So at Khan Academy, our mission, our broad mission, is to provide a free world-class education to anyone, anywhere. And as part of this, we have a variety of partnerships with different organizations like LSAC, who administer high-stakes assessments like the LSAT. And these partnerships that we create, they're not about creating test prep practice, so to speak, that just focus on different test-taking strategies to help gain the assessment. That's not what we're all about. Rather, what we do is we provide high-quality, personalized content and practice to help fill gaps in knowledge that students might have so that we know that they're all ready for law school. And along these lines, part of our mission is that since all of this is free, we hope that by having this offering that we help expand and diversify the pipeline of students attending law school. And we are starting to see some encouraging evidence from some self-report surveys of students that LSAT test takers, that we're seeing greater percentages of women and African-American students that are using Khan Academy LSAT practice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And let me get the deans in on this. Obviously, when we're thinking about how to take some of those concepts of assessment and bring them into our law schools, I know that all of us are thinking hard about that. And Dean Ochoa, maybe you can start us out with a little bit about what is the ABA requiring around assessment and some of the work that you're doing in Indiana.
Yeah, So first I want to congratulate you on a year of running this fabulous show, and also really just thank you for bringing us together to talk about this, because it's very clearly on the minds of all law faculty and deans all over the country since the ABA created standards 301, 302, 314, and 315, which not only mandate, of course, that law schools maintain a rigorous program of legal education to prepare students for a responsible practice after law school, but in more definition, provide and require law schools to develop learning outcomes that are explicit and articulated on the web pages of every law school in the country. And not only to do that with respect to the knowledge and understanding of the substance and procedure of law, but also with respect to skills like legal analysis and reasoning and research and problem solving, as well as the professional responsibility and ethical responsibilities of lawyers once they enter the legal profession, and then a more nebulous requirement of thinking about the other skills that are important for lawyers or law students to take into the world of legal practice and the legal profession. And so those are the standards that have been created by the ABA in Standard 302. And in addition to those, the other new requirements are that the learning objectives must, as I said, be developed and also explicitly stated and readily available, but also that law schools engage with those learning outcomes on a continual basis. So assessing whether those learning outcomes have been attained or the degree to which they're being attained, and also then analyzing the data from that assessment and using the data to determine how to continually improve the quality of legal education and the learning that students are able to engage in while they're at our law schools. What's really interesting as I prepared for this panel, it was, this is one of the reasons I thank you, is that it was the first opportunity that I had taken to take the time to look at some of the learning outcomes that law schools have posted on their web pages. And what was interesting to me in looking at those, that array, was the really divergent ways that law schools have approached the project of integrating Standard 302 into, or translating that into learning outcomes that identify with their schools. So not surprisingly, given the ways that other higher education projects with learning objectives and learning outcomes projects have engaged with those, with that movement in education. Some of the top-ranked schools like Yale and Chicago and Harvard had demonstrate almost full transposition of Standards 302. Yale, in fact, their statement of learning objectives is a transposition of Standard 302. And on the other hand, it's not true that all top-ranked schools have done that. Columbia has articulated 13 learning outcomes that are very much focused on the acquisition of substantive knowledge that will prepare students to make significant contributions to a wide array of practice areas during the course of a long career. And then, really interestingly, a terrific private school in the Midwest has taken a very different approach. They've articulated nearly 60 learning outcomes, 50 of them, or almost 50 of them, really focused on the skills that a lawyer takes into the legal profession, and only 10 of those focusing on the substantive knowledge that our students acquire while they're with us during their 3 years. Indiana has kind of taken I would say sort of a mix of those approaches. We did largely mirror Standard 302. We saw that as a mandate from the ABA, and of course we aim to comply with those standards. But in addition, our faculty felt that it was very important to articulate our commitment to our students over their long lives. And so in the last one of our program goals that we call Passion, we have included items like intellectual curiosity and understanding of the power of law and a commitment to justice, and that those kinds of values are part of what we really do aim to imbue in our students during the time they're with us, and we felt like we were selling ourselves short as well as selling our students short if we did not include that in our learning objectives, despite the fact that we anticipate that at the assessment point and then the measurement point that that's going to be very difficult to measure and articulate with.
It's very helpful. Before I go to the other two deans, I want to pop back to Mark for a minute. And Mark, as much as we all, I think, would love to see that our education was spurring that intellectual curiosity, that passion for justice, what's your initial thought about how you might measure something like that?
I think that there are some skills, some knowledge and skills that lend themselves to multiple choice testing or standardized testing. But then there are other skills that need to be measured repeatedly along the way through one's learning experience. And I think that when we get into the area of soft skills, we need to be looking more at alternative forms of measurement. And not only, sort of a snapshot of one's skills, but repeated measurements of their skills. And I think that those repeated measurements are important because in certain skill areas, it's easy to fake it for that point in time when you know you're going to be assessed. But it's more difficult to sort of maintain that stance over repeated measurements or over, say, 3 years of education.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. And that's something I know that I think all of us want to learn more about, is that we would like to incorporate more what sometimes are called non-cognitive skills in assessment. And one of the challenges is that they're notoriously subject to bias and coachability in terms of, and so that's something that we'll also have to think about as we think about fairness. Let me get the other deans in. Luke and Melanie, tell us, maybe Melanie go first. What's going on in your school? How has your faculty and administration approached this? And then I'd love to go on to hear from some of the innovations in curriculum, Luke, that you've all made.
Okay, terrific. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this really important topic. At Tennessee, we've always prided ourselves on being very focused on student learning and certainly outcomes, but I think the thing that the standards have done really for us, and it's a great benefit, is it caused us to articulate those. We're probably like Indiana, we're somewhere in the middle. We have 7 outcomes that we've articulated, but as you look at the outcomes, sometimes there's 5 or 10 subparts to that. So we've gotten pretty specific, but it's really engaged us to have conversations, lots of conversations about what are our outcomes and how are we measuring those. One of the things that I think is interesting, and we may get to this even later, but we had started on this process before the standards were adopted. That is, we really started having conversations around what our curriculum should look like so that we're sure that we are, what we're priding ourselves on, which is educating folks to be practicing lawyers. How do we know we're doing that? So we'd already started those conversations, we'd already started changing our curriculum, but now I think we can be very intentional, and as Dean Ochoa said, we have to be very intentional about continuously evaluating whether we're meeting the outcomes and what, assessing the assessment and assessing the outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just give you one example. One of the things we did in the very first year is we have an experiential civil procedure course and an experiential tort course. And rather than having the traditional, and I think this is the way many schools are going, but rather than having the traditional summative assessment at the end, one final, we have mandatory midterm and then three some sort of formative assessment in addition to the midterm. So usually there's simulations. And so we can be absolutely positive that all of our students get 2 opportunities in those 2 courses to have multiple formative assessment opportunities. And I think that's something that we were moving to before, but now that once the ABA adopted the standards, that was the little push that we needed to make sure that we were doing those things.
Terrific, thank you. Luke?
And thank you again, as with everybody. This is awfully nice to be here and appreciate the opportunity. It's an important topic, not only because the ABA requires us to do these things, but also because we're concerned about our students. So thanks for that opportunity. At Elon, we had the either advantage or challenge when we redesigned our curriculum about 5 years ago to have an opportunity to really think about what we wanted our students to learn and how we wanted them to learn. We adopted a program of 2.5 years for a JD. We were able to require in that time a full-time experience in practice for credit at what we call a residency in practice, with a course connected to that, so that we have not just the field learning going on, but also some classroom work to supplement that. So when we went through that process to change from the traditional 3 years to the 2.5-year highly engaged, highly experiential, we were able to think about and really articulate what we wanted our students to learn, and when we wanted them to learn it, and how we wanted them to learn it. I'm not sure that the committee and the faculty in going through that exercise would have thought about it this way, but I think what we really were thinking about was that learning is a process, and it would be really good if all of the processes that the students were exposed to, from admission to the bar exam and into practice, were connected, and they're really not connected very well anyway. So what we tried to do in that redesign was to set up a variety of touchstones, a variety of moments, a variety of outcomes at various points in time. That let us think about what those outcomes were, how we wanted to assess them, what we wanted to do in the classroom, what we wanted to do out of the classroom, how to connect that up out of the classroom and in the classroom, and what those assessments look like. Assessments come in all forms and all shapes and all sizes. Some are good, some are bad. We're subject to the U.S. News and World Report. We might all have an opinion on that assessment. In sports, baseball has undergone significant assessment in statistics and things. We have a variety of ways we assess political candidates, some good, some bad. I think the idea in education, legal education in particular, that has not really articulated these things in the past, there's an enormous opportunity to really sit down and think about that in a very creative, thoughtful, and ultimately helpful way to our students, particularly if we think about the process of learning and what really counts as students prepare to become lawyers. We went through that because we made a change. We are constantly reviewing and assessing. We were granted some outside funding to do an assessment after 3 years of our new program, which we expect that report to come in this fall. That will be widely shared in legal education. I think we will learn a lot about how those kinds of assessments of our students and their progress are unfolding. We've seen what we think are some pretty positive results from our program. We've seen improvements in a variety of the areas that the ABA asks us to be interested in, and certainly the areas that we're interested in as our students progress from prospective students to the bar exam and to be lawyers. So we're very pleased with that, but that allows us to do that continual improvement that I think we all aspire to. So, I would commend everyone to change your curriculum in a significant way, because that will require you to do precisely what we're talking about today in a helpful way.
Thank you, all three, and it's exciting to hear some of those changes that are happening. And for the record, Bill, I think we should report to Barry that they were already happening. The ABA didn't make them do it. He'll love that. I usually don't do this, but in celebration of our anniversary, I'm going to put Ken on the hot seat, and that is that another big change in legal ed is that the ABA standards have changed a bit to allow more online education in the JD, and many schools are responding to take more advantage of that. And so, Ken, you and iLaw work so closely with many schools that are moving that direction. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the online educational context and some of the assessment issues that come up there.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. It's interesting hearing the deans talk, because you're all talking about the experience that you've had adding assessments, right? And in part due to the interface with the ABA, sometimes a bit before, sometimes more crystallized after. As we work in the online space, what's interesting, at least in the 10 years I've been in it, is that assessments have always been a part of what we do. We have thought about it right from the beginning. Online education compared to a lot of residential is a highly disciplined delivery, right? So we start online classes with learning objectives, right? I mean, it's in the part and parcel, it's in the fiber of everything we do. And then necessarily we link the assessments, with those outcomes. So, this is what, what online has done. And part of it may be that, critics of online have asked about quality, critics of online have asked about how are you sure that the students are learning things, so maybe online has been more sensitive because we've had to demonstrate. So just a couple of quick examples, and I do teach online. I taught over 20 years residentially. Formative and summative assessments are part and parcel of every course. They're part of our best practices. We won't produce a course without having formative and summative assessments. And the formative are the ones that every week we're judging what the students are doing. We're evaluating what the students are doing. And they're in something sometimes as simple as knowledge checks with objective questions, but they're discussion boards, they're interaction among students where we also create an academic community. But what we do with the formative assessments when they occur weekly is we can have early intervention. So, one of the frustrating things as a teacher is you get through 13 weeks and you finally realize when you grade an exam that the person apparently wasn't getting it. Or wasn't working hard enough. Well, with online, we're constantly letting associate deans know when we think somebody's not working. We're able to look at a student's work from week to week to week, and we're able to say, Mr. and Ms. So-and-so, this really isn't at the par of what you did last week. It's not at the same level, and you can have some interaction. And then on the summative side, again, at least unlike the traditional legal ed where you had, a big exam at the end, and we've mostly moved away from that. Every time you finish a unit, you can give a student a really reflective application of that knowledge. So I'll give you just a real quick, I teach healthcare compliance. You finish a unit on STARK 2 regulation. You can say to the student, well, now assume that you're in the role of a general counsel to a not-for-profit hospital system. The not-for-profit hospital system wants to acquire for-profit toxicology labs. Write a memo or a presentation. We can tape a presentation to the board and first explain the regulation to the board and then give the board 3 paths to achieve the goal where you have better toxicology services for your patients. You're doing it in an economically feasible way for the hospital, and you stay within the regulation. And that's just, again, I think you can do that in residential learning, but in online it's really mandated that you do that.
Great, appreciate that.
Can I ask, Ken?
Sure.
When you were describing your online opportunities and you're having constant formative assessment, I closed my eyes and I imagined you were talking about non-podium classes in a residential program, but writing programs, academic success programs. Can you comment on that? We in legal education have an idea of what classes or what different kinds of classes are supposed to look like, and they don't always match up with how we know students best learn, right? High impact practices, iterative, immersive kinds of experiences. So you describe some of that in courses that might not be the traditional kinds of courses where you would see that, but why wouldn't we try to adapt that into the law school curriculum more generally?
You can. I mean, you absolutely can. So, first, I think you're right. I'm presupposing a classroom model, and what I'm presupposing on this is it's an asynchronous class with, say, 5 modules a week and a certain number of learning modules. You really can do it in residential teaching. I'm going to say I'm pretty dictatorial here. We kind of mandate them when we do online education, and I'm not sure that in the residential setting you would always get that same level of buy-in or investment. I will say that for the teacher and the students, it's a lot of work, right? Because students can't opt out, and when we first started doing online, we would have students that would kind of blow off some of that, and we would really have to say, just so you know, if for no better reason, this is like 5% of your grade every week or 10% of your grade every week. And you really need small group settings for the online, because particularly if the students are going to interface in discussions, you've got to grade them in small groups. So again, I think you can do that.
That's great, and I want to ask the other 2 deans too, just have there been obstacles that you've run into in your schools where you think there could be more progress made in assessment? I'm thinking and also just wondering, we still teach a lot of classes in pretty big groups. Is that an obstacle? And maybe Dean Ochoa first.
Yeah, sure. So interesting sort of conversation between Mark and Luke there, mostly for a couple of reasons. And I want to address your question in particular, Kelly, with respect to obstacles. To answer that question, I think we need to separate the question of the standards and the requirement that we now develop learning outcomes from the question of assessment, because it suggests that the first engagement of law schools with assessment was at the moment that the ABA required us to have learning outcomes, which is of course not the case. And we've been doing assessment for a long time, and the innovations in assessment have come actually, I think, before the standards were created and delivered to law schools. And so there are lots of innovations in assessment methods for in-life physical class experiences. So many of our faculty now use clickers or surveys on a regular basis, either after every class or every week. Many of our colleagues do practice exams during the course of the semester, do short essays during the course of the semester, do a significant amount of group work that is either graded by the faculty member or it's a team project that the students assess each other, and then the faculty member gets involved in a overview of that assessment. Some of my colleagues make a practice of meeting with small groups on a regular basis to assure that the small groups, that each of the members of the small group is attaining the knowledge that the faculty member believes they're delivering. And all of that, I think it's important to really think about, the ABA has explicitly said that the purpose of the standards is to move from the focus on teaching to the focus on learning. And I think that these innovations in evaluation and assessment are really for the purpose of assuring both that we are being intentional in our teaching, but also aware of whether our students are actually getting the benefits of what we think we're teaching. And of course, we don't have full control over that, despite our intentions. And so the formative assessments during the course of a semester let us be both intentional and also really observatory about whether our students are taking the agency they need to be taking in order to actually be learning what we think we're delivering. Because that's an item within the learning process that, of course, we can't control.
Yeah, and Christiana, the only thing I'll add on that too, we're talking about assessments of students, but the more you get that feedback from all your students continuously, you really are there's an assessment of you. I mean, how the course is going, right? So you're doing constitutional law and you have these assessments and nobody's understanding the concept of standing, maybe it's not them, you kind of have to go back.
That's a great point. Melanie?
Yeah, so I think the obstacles that you might have anticipated, the one you said, Kelly, is probably the most obvious. In a really big class, can't do as much formative assessment. We haven't had any problem with that, whether it's quizzes or clickers or multiple choice or whatever it is. We've had no problems with that. I think there have been really two obstacles. One is, and this is rare, at least at Tennessee, but there are some people who have been teaching for 30 or 40 years and they believe very much in the Socratic method. And if they believe in the Socratic method, they may just not fundamentally believe that the having quizzes or having that sort of feedback is an appropriate way to teach law school, but there's been little of that. I think the other thing is kind of the opposite of what the ABA, I think, was trying to do, and that is because all of us were working on assessment before, and you crystallize this, you have to have outcomes, you have to assess. I think there is some fear by some faculty members that we need to set up the outcome so that we can prove that we are accomplishing the outcome. In other words, fear that the ABA will come in and as they do their reviews will be like, oh, well, you've set up this, but you're not reaching that. All your students are not reaching those things. And so there's a little bit of a perverse outcome there, but it's actually been minimal because I think most faculty really care about teaching students and they want to do whatever is best. And as we learn more about teaching, then we adapt and we teach better.
Yeah, very helpful. Kelly, I want to come to you and just ask whether from the Khan Academy's experience and perspective, any comment from you on some of these issues our deans have been raising?
Yes, is really in like K-12 education and assessment. So it's so interesting to hear the deans speak about legal education and how outcomes focused they all are, and the alignment to their curriculum. Very similar conversations happen in K-12 as well. But the degree to which they're leveraging technology for formative assessment, and that instructors are using that data to then help with their instruction in the classroom, those certainly are all best practices. So it's great to hear that all of that is happening, and Khan Academy is just another tool that does something similar to all of that with our personalized mastery-based learning. You know, we provide learners with content that's like at their learning edge to help them progress at their own pace. And so what we can do is we can, you know, through our videos and stuff, we provide really like in plain language, explaining really complex concepts, and then also like kind of modeling how to work through problems and thinking behind the approach. And then students are able to practice, and then their practice exercises, those formative assessments, instructors can then use in the classroom to better differentiate instruction for them. And so I think what all of the deans are talking about and what you're doing is really great and well aligned with the best practices and what we're also trying to do at Khan Academy.
Terrific. And I know that, you know, most of our children are on the Khan Academy site all the time, but all of us may not be. And I'm hoping to link some of these learning communities in that sense. But it is really a goal, I think, if we think about every law student having kind of a personalized learning journey. That model that Khan has can, you know, really set off some ideas, I think, about how that might be accomplished. Mark, there's another community I want to get into this mix here, because you've also had a lot of experience in the medical education field, and I wonder if you have any comments on anything you've seen there that legal education might profitably consider as we continue our advancement in the field of assessment.
Let me share a couple of thoughts. First, a couple of the themes that I heard going through the discussion of the last 5 minutes were people are using multiple assessments at multiple points in time, which sounds like a great idea. It overcomes that reliability issue, can overcome issues related to bias. So it's giving students, not only giving students feedback at multiple points in time, but it's giving instructors the opportunity to evaluate students at multiple points in time. And the other comment I heard was that assessments come in all sizes and shapes, and it sounds like the deans are using all of those different sizes and shapes of assessments in their programs. And Kelly went on to talk about leveraging technology, and I think that's where medical education has made some great strides. In terms of, one of the products that's available to medical educators to help them overcome one of the obstacles. One of those obstacles is just the time and effort required to produce test items or different assessment formats. So there are a couple of different organizations out there that offer medical schools an opportunity to lease item banks or item pools, ranging from a few thousand to several thousand test questions, as well as the platform that allows instructors or faculty to put the test together or assemble the tests so that the test will conform to the local curriculum or the material taught in that instructor's particular course. So that's one way they're leveraging technology, and the educational technology companies seem to be very responsive to the needs that they hear from faculty in terms of the capabilities that they want to see from these different systems. Something that's less technologically driven but enabled by technology is that faculties across different medical schools, and maybe this is done in legal education as well, but they're forming consortia, particularly to deal with complex assessment methods. So one of the important forms of assessment in medical education over the last 20 years or so has been assessing clinical skills at various points in time through someone's education. And these clinical skills assessments take place in what you might call assessment centers. Well, every medical school can't afford the time and the space and so on to create one of these assessment centers. So it's common for them to form consortia where they will share physical resources and share faculty resources to make these sorts of assessments happen. Consortia get together as well just to share test items across the item banks or scoring rubrics as well for essay questions. Then sort of a final area where, or at least another area where technology has made a contribution is being able to harness or use students as contributors to the assessment process. And one way that's being done is crowdsourcing test material development to students. There's a group in the field of medical education that has a product known as Osmosis. And there's another organization out there doing it as well in Europe, and I can't think of the name of that organization. But what they're doing, or what they have offered, is a platform that allows students to go on and produce test questions that they'll then share with other students who they receive feedback from in terms of the quality of these questions. Now, the project that I worked on, we actually allowed these questions to filter up through the system and did some testing on them. Students can develop them for their own use, for sure, but I think if faculty get together to promote such an activity, then I think that would give them an opportunity to benefit from the students' labor. It benefits students, it benefits faculty. I think it's just, it's been a great idea whose time has come, and technology has sort of made that possible.
Great, Mark, thank you. And the idea around assessing, in the clinical education field is one legal education I think should really take note of, as we all have tried to do more and more experiential learning and develop good assessment methods for that. Ken, I want to turn this back to you to open it up to our audience and make any comment you have as we do that. And I know I've been asked to remind everyone to, if you can, ask your question through a microphone. I think we have some Brad has to pass around, and to feel free to pose your question to the panel as a whole or any particular speaker.
Great.
Ken?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So we'll open it up for questions or comments. Yep. If you could just tell us your name and who you're affiliated with, and then we'll...
Oh, I'd prefer not to do that.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. So, Gina Warren at the University of Houston Law Center. I've incorporated assessments throughout my teaching just because I think it's fun. But I've heard a lot of concerns from some of my colleagues that when you have assessments, especially if you have graded assessments, that those can result in having a certain number of negative faculty reviews. So when it comes time for the students to review you, right, historically it's been intended to be in a space that wouldn't have any impact on their final grade, with regard to grading. And if you have assessments along the way that have grades, then you have an opportunity for the students who are not happy about those assessments to give you a negative faculty assessment that can be extremely important to those that are still in the tenure track situation. So I'm curious as to hear if you have had any of those concerns and what your thoughts are on addressing those concerns.
And that's why you didn't want to give your name, right, on that one? That's pretty good.
This is for a friend.
So, Deans, what advice would you have for her friend?
Well, I actually think that is a valid concern. I think once the culture of your law school changes such that everybody or almost everyone is doing it, then the likelihood that an individual faculty member will suffer that negative evaluation reduces substantially. But as people first adopt it, and they, as you say, students get a grade on their formative assessment that is not what they were expecting, they can definitely hold it against a faculty member. I still think it's, the right thing to do is the right thing to do, but I think developing that culture where more faculty members are buying in and doing those multiple assessments is really important.
Yeah, I agree quite a lot there. Two examples from our law school. In fact, the first faculty member who did a significant amount of group work during the course of a semester and assessed that group work, or had students assess each other in doing that group work, initially had very negative blowback as a result of his initial experiments. Now, surely his initial forays into doing that got better as he practiced, but it's also true that a number of his colleagues, of my colleagues, started to do the same thing in their classrooms, and that became part of our learning experience for our students, and that became much more standardized. And so there's not as much negative feedback on the practice. That's also true for practice exams during the semester, or graded exams during the semester, to the extent that you require that. 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that was very unusual and seen as an unwelcome distraction for students along the way. And now, if you don't have an opportunity for students to engage with your testing method at some point before the final exam, that's seen almost as an abdication of your responsibility to the student and their capacity to succeed in your classroom. So I do think that there's a change in culture that when you're the outlier and an innovator, it's harder.
I would add to that, I agree with all of that. I would add to that, if you're doing sort of iterative assessments along the way, you're going to develop relationships with the students that are a little bit different. And we know that those relationships are key to learning and advancement for the students. And I think that works to counter some of the negative concerns that faculty might have, certainly if that were part of a broader culture. And those deeper relationships not only ameliorate some of those concerns, but I think they contribute a great deal to the opportunity for better learning.
I want to mention one other thought from a dean perspective too on that, which is that the real question is then, how do those teaching evals get used in the institution? And I know that I noticed early on that legal writing faculty would get graded by the students more harshly, and I think it was because they were giving grades along the way, right? And so if you can get your institution to start, looking at the groups of student evaluations by group rather than across all faculty, and maybe even look at who's doing formative assessments and grading and who's not, and look at the averages and all. It's kind of, if you will, slice and dice those differently and not just assume that everyone's similarly situated, then the use of those might not be, as pernicious in the institution.
You can after you read thousands of those student evaluations, you get a sense of what are the one-offs and what are the ones that are serious and raising, significant concerns about a particular teaching style or teacher or methodology. So, I think that just comes with some history and understanding and getting better at understanding what those evaluations do and how to use them. Yeah.
I was just going to ask culturally to the deans, if you do assessments during the semester, is just take a lot more coordination so that if somebody is going to give a midterm, 5 weeks in and students stop preparing for other classes, is the culture better and you get less negative if there's just more coordination somehow?
I'll speak from personal experience rather than decanal experience. So I teach contracts, which is a first-year course, and also, so our legal research and writing program has always had multiple assessments during the course of the semester. Early on in my time at Indiana, I was giving a midterm assessment, and I always have coordinated with their calendar to make sure that I'm not giving my due date for my midterm assessment is not due on the same day as one of their major writing assignments. I think that's just a kindness to our students. So I think some coordination is a good idea. Of course, it becomes more difficult when everybody starts to do those assessments.
Right.
I was going to say, that's the hard thing now. At Tennessee, we do so many upper level and first year that it's a burden on the students in some way. We started talking about, are we burdening them by doing too much of this?
Right.
And on the other hand, when they become lawyers, they're going to have to balance a whole bunch of stuff. Time management is an important skill for them to learn early, and we spend a fair amount of time talking about that. That's not to say that we want to overwhelm them with 12 exams on one day or 12 writing assignments due all at the same time. And coordination is difficult. It requires a little bit more work. But if you're trying to accomplish those things, you figure out a way to try to do that. It's not going to be perfect, but perfect's the enemy of the good. Plus, we are trying to teach them how to do a whole bunch of stuff at once, because that's what ultimately they're going to have to do.
Yeah, those are great insights, and we're now getting some questions remotely, and that actually answers one of the questions about the workload for students. Before we get to I see one hand up in the room. I do want to ask Mark and Kelly remotely. We had somebody remind us that our description of today said that we would talk about using Google Hangouts, mind maps, and marker spaces as innovations for assessment. So, Mark or Kelly, you want to address that for us? Mark,
Go ahead,
you want
Mark, was that-
or Kelly? Kelly, why don't you go?
Yeah, so that isn't, it's certainly something that's happening in the K-12 space is, using like Google Forms, for example, as a quick and cheap way to create an assessment, to be able to administer a free online assessment with Google Forms. What were the other two pieces of technology that you mentioned?
It's Google Hangouts, mind maps, and marker spaces.
Yeah, so mind maps are an interesting way to be able to show, the connectedness between different concepts, to kind of show, like, as an overview of your course, maybe how key concepts are interrelated to each other. I haven't really heard of that in terms of using it for an assessment. I've heard of that more of like a review type of activity. And then Google Hangouts is more of like a video thing. I think maybe Google Forms would be a more appropriate type of technology for an assessment.
Yeah, I'll just throw in two, and this would go whether it's online or residential. I mean, students can record things, right? I mean, you can even take an online class and a faculty member can say, okay, audience, now each student please record record a question. So you can do that. You can have a negotiation and then have the faculty member look at that. I did see we had a question in the third row. Yeah, I'll give you the...
Hi, I'm Liz. I teach in Vermont, and I'm wondering, and this may be beyond the scope of this panel, but I'm thinking about how much legal education has changed since I went to law school. Some of you may remember we didn't even have exams until the end of the first year. And I'm wondering if any of you think that lawyers 5 years out are in any way different than they were 50 years ago. How are we assessing them?
I'm going to throw that open and see who's brave enough.
So is any of this making any difference at all? another way to say it.
Yeah.
So I have no way to assess whether lawyers are different now than before I was born. Right, exactly. So I'm going to approach my attempts to address your question from that admitted position of ignorance. But I will say that I think that it is really valuable. The nugget in your question that I think is really valuable is the question of whether the project of learning outcomes and assessment contributes to the learning outcomes that we think it contributes to. Is it increasing the ability of students to learn? Does it increase the ability of our schools to prepare lawyers for an ethical, prepared practice of law over the long term of their careers? And related to that, is it possible to have continual improvement in our system of legal education? I think all of those are very valid questions. And admittedly, right, when you look at the literature in other fields with respect to learning outcomes and assessment, the empirical data on that is still pretty bare. So there's some data in the medical field, there's some data in political science, there's some data in English, and the data is actually really mixed. So in the medical field, it appears that the Learning Outcome Project is really helpful in helping medical schools define, in other words, be intentional about what their goals are. But it's not very helpful in assessing whether doctors are better equipped to do the complex work of doctors. I suspect that we will find that that's true in legal education as well. In political science, it appears that the Learning Outcome Project has not increased the substantive acquisition of knowledge at all. And political science, I think, is at least related to law, and so we may not be terribly surprised to find ourselves 10 years from now wondering whether it has improved the quality of legal education overall. So I think that the project of learning outcomes has a lot of question marks over it, simply because we don't have sufficient empirical data at this point to know either whether it really works to achieve the outcomes that we hope it does, or how to modify the project so that it has those effects.
I would
Go ahead,
add,
Lou.
I don't know that we really know what the outcomes are that we want. I mean, there have been, over the last 30 years, how many major reports that are changing what we're doing? McCrate, Schultz-Zedek, we all ran to that, and Carnegie, and Denver did a big thing a couple years ago. But I don't know that we've ever really come around to a consensus over what it is we're supposed to be doing, other than the ABA standard that said preparing folks for practice of law. That's what we're supposed to be doing. But I don't know that there is deep consensus around what those skills and outcomes are supposed to be. I tell that, there's a member of the Elon law faculty here, and she's going to scream because she's heard this story 40 times. I'm a third-generation lawyer. My grandfather graduated from law school in 1922. My father graduated from law school in 1952. I graduated in 1982. It's almost another 40 years since then, which I'm sorry to admit. But that's about 100 years. And I suspect my grandfather would be relatively comfortable if he popped into a law school today. That's just wrong. The world is deeply different today than it was 100 years ago, and if we continue to do roughly what we did then, and I concede clinics and all of those things, but we're doing roughly what we did 100 years ago, and that's just wrong. The students are different. The problems that the students have to solve with society are different. Their clients are significantly different. The tools available to them are different, and we're more alike than different from 100 years ago. And that just doesn't make logical sense to me. Assessment is a way to help figure out what are we doing well, what should we be doing better.
One of the real challenges to your question too is data. We don't have good systems of collecting across the enrollment journey. It's something that we're working on to try and provide law schools tools where they might be able to longitudinally figure out who's coming in, how things are going, licensure, practice, but that's really difficult even right now if we wanted to try and study that. So it's a really great question, and I hope that conversations like this can keep spurring it, us to really, assess ourselves in assessing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we keep having this theme of, online versus residential, and again, you could apply what I'm about to say to both, but when online students take exams, they take them through a learning management system, and we do collect data, right? And we can see how long people spend on assignments and how long they spend on discussions, and what questions they get right this semester, and what semester, what they got wrong the last semester. So we really can collect data and provide it back to the schools. And it'd be interesting to think of in residential programs, how much of that's going on, the data collection of it?
Well, and you really can't do it. I mean, it's one of the reasons we went to a digital version of the
Yeah.
LSAT, because when somebody's just filling out bubbles or writing, you can't know things like that like you can when it's in that format.
We just hired a person to do some data analytics on our staff, but we don't know what to do with her. What should we be collecting? We're a relatively young school, so we don't have a lot of data to start with, but what should we be collecting? How can we use it? What can we do with it? We don't even know. We are not a data-driven enterprise, legal education, the legal practice. And that's not to say we should be nothing but data. I'm not suggesting that by any means, but certainly there are data that can help us understand and help us do better than we currently do.
I have one suggestion for you. One suggestion, which is you had a very visionary dean some years ago, and Elon admitted, I think, 10% of their entering class over a period of time, based not on LSATs, but on oral interview, to look at the difference in extroversion and introversion on the Myers-Briggs scale. And I have always wondered whether you've ever looked to see if those people who didn't have such good LSATs turned out to be just as good lawyers.
Well,
There's some data.
We interview everybody now, so we are developing a data set where we can do some of those things precisely for the reasons you suggest. You know, 50 years ago, it's the same number of lawyers in law school, right? Law students in law school today as there were 50 years ago. It's not a good, twice as many people, complex problems. We need to improve what we're doing and know how we're doing it a little bit better.
Hi, I'm Anna Shavers from Nebraska. I just had a quick question about collecting this data. For example, you said you hired a consultant or an expert to help you decide what kind of data you need for the staff. So who are these experts? What kind of expert do you look for to advise a law school about who all's in the law school community?
I think there's a couple up here on the screen. You know, our intention was to hire someone who had some facility with data. I'm not sure this is a person that we would hire to design a complete and total program about how to use data. We just know that we had some, and we thought we could understand it better to do things like you suggested. Is it the interviews that make a difference? Is it, you know, that's pretty simple data analysis as I understand how data analysis works, but we didn't even have anybody who could really do that stuff with any real capability and reliability, and we thought we should at least have that capability and reliability. I suspect there's folks on here, certainly Kellie has an enormous data set that could be used to be very helpful, and as I understand it, they're trying to figure out how to do that. It's way beyond my knowledge and understanding, but you know, there are people that do that sort of thing, and certainly beyond my resources as a young law school that's tuition dependent.
Certainly why we want to try and be helpful to law schools, to all law schools. I will say that the entire field of educational assessment and educational technology is enormous, and I had no sense of it. You know, you think about going to ALS and seeing the big exhibitor hall at innovations and assessment conferences I go to, there's 4 times that of organizations and companies that do this work. So it's just one of those huge industries and fields that I think legal education hasn't been quite as adjacent to as we might. I'm always happy to give people information that I've gained, so just please feel free to reach out.
I'm going to throw out a final question, Kelly. I think you're going to then close and talk about our next program. So we've had some questions about personalized assessments. So when we use a variety of types of assessments, one of the advantages is that some students perform better or differently depending on the type of assessment, right? We know that students to some extent get to personalize things. I know, you know, with online, we often will let students take an exam in any 3-hour chunk that they want. You know, we'll monitor it anytime, 24/7 during a particular week. But Christiana, we'll start with you. Any ideas of whether we can, you know, both have a fair level playing field of assessments while also trying to do some personalization?
Yeah, so a few thoughts. When there are a variety of different tools that a person can use in a live classroom to do, and also true in a remote classroom, to do personalized assessment, right? So whether that's through, through any of the ones that I mentioned earlier, right? So clicker numbers can be associated with a person if you get that sign up from students ahead of time, or if they know about that ahead of time. Practice exams obviously have that capacity. The individualized conversations that you have either with groups or with individual students during the course of a semester. Obviously, for larger classes, that's more of a challenge, and that would be true for a asynchronous or synchronous online class, same as it is for an in-person class. But over the course of the 3 years of a legal education, of course, students have the terrific opportunity to have both large classrooms where they're learning from lots of their cohort as well as the professor, in addition to the very personalized, tailored education that they are seeking in the form of experiential learning, clinical education, small writing classes, et cetera. So there are lots of opportunities over the course of 3 years, both in large classes as well as in small classes, to get personalized feedback. The question, you know, and the important message, I think, to students is that the best way to engage with that assessment is to avail yourself of it, right? And that I think is a real it's a real challenge for I think for all of us who are working with students to make sure that they know that assessment is not a judgment, but rather effort to ensure that they graduate with all the skills and competencies and knowledge that they need, and that's very much a nurturing process, not a judgmental one.
Great.
Any other comments from you, Carmel? All right, well, I know
If I could just,
Yes,
if I could
please,
add
Kellie.
to that. Thank you. Yeah, you had mentioned that this idea around like personalized assessments, and you know, in the assessment field, the closest thing I think to what's happening there would be adaptive assessments. There are some large-scale assessments out there that, based on how a student responds, it adapts the level of questioning. And so, if they're not answering a stream of questioning, it'll go to a lower level skill set to start assessing a student there. So there are, to some degree, you know, with the advantages of technology, some larger scale assessments that do that kind of personalized type of assessment with adaptive assessment.
Right.
I just want to mention that.
Yeah.
It's a great point. No, that is a very important one. And I want to close by, Kelly, thanking you and Mark for joining us from afar. It's really nice to have two people who work squarely in this field with us today and helping legal education advance in this area. And then I also want to thank the deans who are here with us today too for their great contributions, as well as my co-host. Let me remind you that we do this monthly, and we do a little once in a while in the summer. Maybe we get off kilter a little bit, but for the most part every month you can join live with Kellye and Ken. And our next show is August 26th, and it's always from 4 to 5:15 Eastern Time. And the topic that we have in August is gender equity in law. So jumping from one big topic into another one. So August 26th, gender equity in law from 4 to 5:15 Eastern Standard. So we hope you'll continue to join live with Kellye and Ken, and we thank you all for inviting us here to SEALS. And please join me in thanking our panel for being with us today, both here and remotely.